Great, welcome back. So we've covered execution attributes in terms of divergence so far. We've gone through some style attributes involving behavior, calculated time-weighted order frequencies, calculated cumulative returns that are otherwise visible to you on the platform for any Darwin listing. And we've also talked about how to extract Darwin versus EURUSD volatility attribute data, again from the FTP repository via your code base. Today we'll focus on rotation, how to get daily rotation data for a particular Darwin. And if you're curious as to the definition of rotation, we define rotation as the volume of all the orders opened by a Darwin in monetary value divided by its quote price. That's the Darwin's equity. The reasoning, the motivation behind calculating and presenting rotation is that a stable rotation is an indicator of a balanced trading strategy. And likewise, it's also an indicator of the volume of commissions and consequently of the diversification rebates generated by the Darwin. And this information is, of course, useful from a Darwin investor or trader's perspective. To get Darwin rotation data, again, you need to access the Darwin Data Analytics FTP repository. If we go into the FTP repository as we have in previous tutorials, that's very simply if you've set it up as a network location in Windows 10 or you're using software such as FileZilla or Core FTP Lite, then you can simply log into the FTP repository using your credentials and scroll down to the Darwin of your choice and visualize this data. The data we're interested in that you see on the Darwin's listing, in this case, the example Darwin being LVS, this daily rotation data is stored in a file called rotation. Again, it's encoded in the same way as any other data that's stored here. And to study it, instead of downloading the file and opening it in a text editor, we'll go back into our Python environment and load this data there using the same class that we have been so far. In this case, we'll use because we haven't implemented rotation yet, we're going to use the get data function that we've previewed in previous tutorials and download LVS's raw rotation data directly into our Python environment and study it to see how we can go about extracting it, presenting it correctly in the form of a data frame. For this purpose, we'll set data frame to false so we can take a look at the data itself, see how it's structured. And once you download the data, you'll see that there is a millisecond timestamp, D periods, and the actual daily rotation value alongside it. If you use the get data function with the df parameter set to true instead of false as we did earlier, then this code will go ahead and convert all of that encoded data into a presentable data frame that you can then process further, post-process further. So in our case, for instance, we'll just download this data into a data frame. We'll call that, let's call it something meaningful as LVS_rotation. And once we've got that data into LVS_rotation, let's set our columns up. In this case, we'll say the columns are, so we'll need this column definition later as well. So we'll say the timestamp is what we have first, D periods is what we have next, and finally we have the value for daily rotation. Once we've set these columns up, LVS is not defined because it's actually LVS_rotation. And there we go. So now if we visualize the data frame again, we'll see that the columns have been set up correctly. And this allows us to do some convenience things such as setting timestamps and converting values from millisecond timestamps to human readable date time 64, etc. And we'll do that now. The purpose in this tutorial for doing that is to visualize this data alongside other data that we've been extracting so far in previous tutorials, and also to demonstrate to you in the next part of this video how to amalgamate data from the Darwin API and the Darwin Data Analytics repository into one unified interface so you can study data visually a lot better than having to download data in separate locations, or for that matter, visualize data in separate locations, as is the case on the platform. For instance, you have the return risk data available to you via return risk, where you can visualize the Darwin's return in terms of quote, of course, and the Darwin versus EURUSD volatility. But to visualize time distributions, as we've covered in the time-weighted order frequency tutorial, And to visualize data such as rotation, you need to switch tabs to assets and timeframes. While that has its use cases and benefits, of course, combining this information into one interface that you can do on your own through your Python environment allows you to visualize this data simultaneously and study it for patterns, both visually, as in manually, as well as algorithmically. So before we get to that part in the next video, this was just to give you an idea of what it all looks like. Rotation taking the place of volume that is otherwise commonly observed in traditional asset classes such as futures and stocks. So let's go back to our environment and then take a look at this data. Our purpose is to visualize this data alongside other important data for this Darwin, in this case LVS, and that will include for this demonstration the quote of the Darwin, the underlying strategy return of the Darwin that is otherwise observed through the underlying strategy tab. You can amalgamate all of this information into one by getting the quote data from the Darwin API, the underlying strategy's cumulative return data from the Darwin Data Analytics repository via FTP, the daily rotation data via FTP as well, and the Darwin versus EURUSD volatility data via the FTP as well. This allows us to create a unified interface that we'll cover in the next tutorial. For the time being, in order to process this data manually and just chart it, you'll need to convert the millisecond timestamps into human-readable date times and then set the index of this data frame to that timestamp column so that you can plot daily rotation appropriately. Now that you know what the data looks like in raw format, how our code that's provided to you open source on GitHub allows you to convert that raw data into a processable data frame, and what to do with the data frame going forwards, we'll now switch to the next part of the video where we'll go ahead and post-process this data further and go through the components required and the code required to generate example user interfaces such as this, where you combine data from the Darwin API for a particular Darwin, as well as data from the FTP Analytics repository. See you in the next tutorial. As always, if you enjoyed this presentation, please do consider sharing it with your social networks, colleagues, co-workers, and friends. And do subscribe to the Darwinex YouTube channel so you remain up to date with all future videos that will be released in this series and other topics discussed on Darwinex. Thank you very much for your attention. See you next time.